You're listening to the Confidence Alchemist radio show with your host, the Confidence Alchemist himself, Keith Blakemore Noble. To find out more, visit theconfidencealchemist.com, but not before you've listened to this episode of the Confidence Alchemist radio show.
Hello, a very warm welcome to the almost completely everything you wanted to know about phobias, but were afraid to ask. Now, I'm really pleased that you're taking time to listen to me talking about phobias and discussing phobias, because this is something which affects far more people than is generally realised. See, figures vary for this because a lot of people do not mention their phobias to anyone. Ironically, in many cases, because they have a fear of being judged or laughed at, even though a phobia is a perfectly natural condition which can happen to absolutely anyone. It's estimated that typically around about 3 to 4% of the entire population of the world have a phobia at any one time. Which means that if you currently have a phobia, then you're in a group of around 225 to 300 million people. This can only mean one thing. Clearly, you are not alone. The aim of this episode, dear listener, is to give an introduction into what phobias are, why we have them, where we get them from, what phobias are not, and also we're going to take a look at historical ways of attempting to cure phobias, why those are not necessarily the way you want. We're going to take a look at freedom from phobia, which I've been using to help people for 8 years now to completely conquer their phobias. And we're going to take a look at some stories from some people who have done exactly that, conquered their phobias and gained their own freedom from phobia. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves there. So let's start from the beginning. What is a phobia? Well, it comes from the Greek term phobos, which means a fear or a morbid fear. And really, a phobia is an intense, irrational fear of something that actually poses little or no real danger. An intense, irrational fear of something that poses little or no real danger. That's what makes a phobia a phobia. Yes, it's very intense, but it's also irrational. And the thing is, even though people suffering from phobia may realise that it's totally irrational, heck, they may even say that itself. You know, I know my fear of whatever is completely irrational, but heck, they still terrify the living daylights out of me. Even thinking about the feared object or situation can be enough to bring on the symptoms of a phobia. Now, for some people, phobia is triggered when you encounter the situation, such as when you're actually sitting in the dentist's chair, or when you actually see a spider, or when you're actually on a plane. Now, for other people, even just thinking about the thing is enough to bring on the symptoms of a phobia and to bring on that panic, that anxiety, to bring the whole lot on. Now, phobias, they're a learned response. We'll cover that in a few moments, and we'll see in a few moments how we learn phobias. But the important thing to remember is we are not born phobic. We're not born with phobias. Quite the reverse. But we are taught to be phobic, either by others or through our own scary experiences. Now, the good news there is that this means that we can learn new, positive, empowering ways to respond instead. Because we learned how to do a phobia, it means we can learn how to do something different, some other way to behave. And paradoxically, the stronger your phobia is, the better able you are to completely conquer it and learn those new powerful ways of behaving. The stronger your phobia is, the better able you are to conquer it. Because the stronger your phobia, the stronger a phobia is, that means you've done a much better job of learning how to do the phobia. Which means you can learn a much better way of conquering that phobia. I'll just repeat that to let it settle in. The fact that you have a phobia means that you're very good at learning this behaviour, which means that you will be very good at learning new ways to behave. If only, of course, if only you knew how. And that's where freedom from phobia comes in. And again, more of that a little later on in this episode. But let's take a look at what some of the symptoms of phobias are. Not everyone is going to experience all of the symptoms. Not everyone's going to experience the same symptoms. Different people will be affected in different ways. But in general, the symptoms of a phobia, it tends to include dizziness, trembling, rapid heart rate, breathlessness. That can be a symptom of phobia. Nausea, cold sweats, or breaking out into a normal sweat. Fear that this thing is actually going to kill you, fears of dying. Or continually thinking or obsessing about the thing. These can all be symptoms of phobia. When you encounter the thing, if you kind of break out into a cold sweat and your heart starts racing 19 to the dozen, and maybe you start feeling a bit breathless, all these things, that's a sign that you've got a phobia rather than just a fear. And in some cases, these symptoms can escalate into a full-scale anxiety attack. Additional symptoms of that can be heart palpitations, trembling, shaking, a feel of choking, chest pain, discomfort, feelings of unreality, or even feeling detached from yourself, fear of losing control or going crazy, even numbness or tingling like pins and needles. All of those can be severe signs of a very strong phobia. Now, at this point, it's very important we take a look at what a phobia is not. It's important to realize that simple fear is absolutely not the same as phobia. Let me explain. You see, for many, many people, talking of having a fear about something simply means they feel a little bit scared about it, or even shudder or feel some mild revulsion, but they don't get the full-on panic, anxiety symptoms of a phobia. Now, for the rest of this episode, sometimes I'm going to refer to a wibble. Now, what the heck is a wibble? Well, it's a generic term I'm using to avoid triggering phobias in anyone who's listening. So, just imagine that a wibble is something which you find really nice and comforting, but which other people sometimes find terrifying and may have phobias about. That's what a wibble is, okay? So, for some people, they might see a wibble and they may shudder a little, but they can still handle it, they can still deal with it, they can still go into the same room as the wibble. That's not a phobia, that might just be a little bit of a fear. But it's not a phobia, because a phobia is an intense irrational fear of something that doesn't pose a threat. A phobia can be debilitating to the extent where you won't even go into the same room as a wibble, or you won't even go into the room in case there might be a wibble there. We'll take a look at a lady later on. We'll take a look at a lady for whom her particular phobia was such that she couldn't even go to the bathroom in her own house if there was no one else in the house, just in case, because of her phobia of spiders. So phobia is very debilitating. Whereas just kind of like a bit of a fear, or a bit of a mild revulsion, or a bit of a ooh, look at that thing. Oof, right, we'll get rid of it. That's not a phobia. So a fear, simple fear, is not the same as a phobia. There are other times when you may get some of the symptoms of a phobia, but it's actually a very valid and potentially life-saving response to a very real and present threat to life and limb. Let's face it, very, very rare to find someone who would not have the symptoms of an anxiety attack if they came face to face with if they were completely unarmed and came face to face with a ferocious and really hungry wild bear, or a madman pointing a loaded gun in their face, or walking a tightrope in windy weather above Niagara Falls. If you're in any of those situations, you're probably going to have anxiety and panic attacks, right? And that's not a phobia. That's fear about something which poses a very definite threat to your life. Whereas with a phobia, the key to it being a phobia is that the emotional response is intense and irrational. For example, you may know that a wibble cannot hurt you, but that doesn't stop the panic attack coming every time you encounter a wibble, causing you to cower in the corner, unable to move until somebody deals with it, or even the thought of a wibble causing you to break out into that cold sweat and trembling. And so it can be very, very debilitating, and that's the key to a phobia. It's an intense, irrational response to something which poses no real danger. So it's intense, it's irrational, and it's about something that poses no real danger. That's what makes it a phobia. So just because you have fear about some things doesn't mean it's a phobia. Sometimes their fear can be a very, very useful, life-saving thing. For example, if you kind of sort of shudder a little bit at the thought of walking unaided along the ridge tiles on the top of a 10-story building, that's not a phobia. That's a very healthy respect for heights. Is this making sense so far? Awesome. Awesome. What kind of things can people have phobias about? Well, phobias can be grouped into sort of 5 different categories, really. We can have phobias about animals, such as spiders, dogs, snakes, those sorts of things. We might have phobias about objects, such as clowns, or dolls, or mirrors, or doors, or tables, or all these sorts of things. Phobias can be of a medical basis, such as injections, or a phobia about visiting the dentist, or about doctors. Phobias can be about situations, such as social situations, being up high, flying, being in crowded environments, being in a totally isolated, empty situation. Or they can be environmental, such as storms, or water, or the countryside, these sorts of things. So that's kind of the 5 different categories that phobias can fall into. And there are many, many, many different phobia. Pretty much anything you can think of, people can have a phobia about. And there's all sorts of lists of the top 10 most common phobias, all these sorts of things. It's kind of difficult to come up with a definitive list because it changes, it varies depending on where you are, who you ask, and so on. But if you were to look at the most common phobias, or create a list of the most common phobias, it would probably include things like heights. That's, no pun intended, pretty high up on the list of phobias. Spiders, that is really, really common. That's quite possibly going to tend to be the most common phobia. Flying, fear of darkness, fear of confined spaces, fear of open spaces, fear of dogs, dentists, social interaction, meeting people, all that sort of thing. Thunder and lightning, that's another fairly common phobia. Seems Queen were right.
Thunderbolt and lightning, very, very frightening me.
There are, obviously there's a great many other phobias. It is possible to have a phobia about anything real or imaginable. You can have phobias about imaginary things. Just because it's not real and physical doesn't mean you can't have a phobia about it. Some less common, rarer phobias. Let's see, phobias of clouds. Phobias about opening your eyes. There are people who go through life terrified at opening their eyes. That can be really, it's rare, but it can be really debilitating. A phobia about anything new or change to something. One of the less common, but more common, if you see what I mean. So one of the more common, less common ones, phobias about holes. If you see those images that some people put on social media and so on about things with lots of holes in them, there's a common lotus leaf one, or all these sorts of things. That can generate phobic responses in some people. There are people who have a phobia about the colour yellow. They break out into full anxiety when they encounter or think of the colour yellow. You can have a phobia about anything. Perhaps the rarest phobia, yet the most damaging phobia of all, is a phobia of thinking, where just having to think or being asked to think brings out this phobia. That, fortunately, is extremely rare, but it is quite probably the most damaging phobia of all. But literally, you can have a phobia about absolutely anything. And yet, it is even possible to have a phobia of phobias, or have a phobia about having a phobia. And it's called phobophobia. So that's a look at what phobias are and the different types of phobias. In a moment, we're going to take a look at sort of what causes phobias and whether they can be cured.